Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Pearls of Wisdom show. I am your host, Anthony, and it is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome my guest, Professor Richard Swinburne. Professor Swinburne is a leading philosopher of religion, a fellow of the British Academy, and a professor emeritus of philosophy at Oxford. He is here to explain why he thinks Hume and Kant were mistaken in rejecting natural theology, aka arguments for theism. Professor Swinburne, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So my first question would be, as you look back over your career, what would you say has been the most satisfying part of your work?
Well, I've always been interested in all really big philosophical questions, and I'm a religious person, and so I was particularly interested in the ones which are more central to religious issues than other ones. And so I've written about, I should say that when I started to do philosophy, I realized that the paradigm of knowledge in the modern world was really science. And believe it or not many people, hardly anybody at Oxford when I was an undergraduate was interested in that. So I spent the first part of my first 10 years probably of my philosophical career trying to understand what had happened in the history of science and trying to assess the criteria by which scientists judge their theories. And some of my writing was on that. But then I moved on to the things that really seemed to me central, the nature of God, the reason to believing there is a God, and the relevance of that to religious faith. And then I wrote about various Christian doctrines, their justification or otherwise. And quite a lot of my more recent writing has been on human nature and the relation of soul and body. And to come back to what is your question, these are all exciting issues, and my work has been very centered on my writing. But as it's all the most, they've all been very satisfying parts. But for the last, before my retirement, for most of 20 years, I was professor of philosophy of religion at Oxford. And my main job was supervising the individual graduate students, and I was privileged to have some pretty bright ones, and I very much enjoyed giving seminars to them and getting their reactions, and I found that very satisfying.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Swinburne. So now I would like to ask you about your Orthodox faith. So you were received into the Orthodox Church later in life. So can you tell us about your move to Orthodoxy and the impact it has had on your life and philosophical thought?
Yes, I joined the Orthodox, was received into the Orthodox Church about 25 years ago. Before that, I had been most of my life a member of the Church of England. I'm not certain what the Canadian name for this is, Anglican or Episcopalian. The reason I moved was that the Church of England itself seemed to me to have changed very much from what it was like when I was young to what it was like when I moved over in the mid-90s. I came to feel that in the mid-90s it had really given up on the idea that it was the custodian of revealed truth, and that doctrine mattered, and that it mattered whether or not we followed the church's moral teaching. I don't like to think of myself as an extreme conservative in any way, but clearly there are some important Christian doctrines that if you deny them, then you really can't count as a Christian. Right. And one obvious example is the doctrine of the incarnation. The doctrine of the incarnation the Church has always held since its first foundation, I would think, but certainly since its formulation in doctrine in the 4th and 5th century, that what happened in the incarnation is that God became a human being. Right. Now, quite a number of theologians recognized as important, and members of the Church of England were teaching not that God became human, but some human became especially open to God. And that seemed to me quite the wrong way around. And the more general point that the Church of England was no longer interested in doctrine came out about that time when it was proposed in the General Assembly that it should be proper for individual priests who taught things that looked as if they were contrary to Christian doctrine to be charged with what would be called in the old days heresy, but at any rate, teaching a gospel other than the Christian doctrine, and if found guilty, debarred from office. But the General Assembly voted against that on the grounds that, well, we mustn't force anybody to do anything. And likewise with teaching about morals. Now, whatever your particular views about sexual morality, it's been pretty central to Christian. A certain view of that has been pretty central to Christian teaching about morals. There's the sacredness of one marriage, of a man and a woman, and so on. Now, maybe that's mistaken, but around that time there was a prominent bishop who made the following statement, that if the Church got out of line with secular morality for very long, that showed that the Church ought to change its view. Once again, the Church is in business to teach its morality and not the secular morality. And it may have got a few things wrong, but it will start from where its own constitutes. So in these various ways, I felt I couldn't really belong anymore. But I've always believed that you can't set up a church on your own, as it were. It has to be derived from bishops who go back to the apostles, and it has to have the Nicene Creed as central to it. And that just left me with a choice between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Many people were surprised that I didn't become a Catholic on the grounds that Catholics like splitting hairs in the way that philosophers do, and Orthodox aren't very keen on that, or at any rate it seemed to some people that they weren't. But I didn't become a Catholic because I don't believe in the infallibility of the Pope, nor in the two Marian doctrines of the Immaculate Conception and the bodily assumption of Mary. And that's simple. That's why. Yes, Orthodox have been rather suspicious of my sort of way of doing doctrine over the past 300 or 400 years. But they have to realize, and they do come to realize, that really the great theologians of the past, whom they greatly revered, they all did theology in the sort of way that I did. They all produced arguments for the existence of God. John of Damascus, Gregory of Nyssa, Athanasius. And when this is pointed out to Orthodox, they say, yes, I suppose you're right about this.
Thank you very much, Richard Swinburne. So now we can begin our discussion of Hume and Kant. So let's begin with Hume. So Hume leveled, at least through the characters of the dialogues concerning naturalism, religion, various criticisms against the teleological argument in particular. So, and I hope we can analyze them in turn. So first, has the designer properly been shown to possess all of the traditional divine attributes? So there may well be a designer, but why should we assume that the designer is perfect? So the designer of my computer, there's definitely a designer to my computer, but I have no reason to suppose that this designer is perfect, do I?
The word is shown, or your word is shown to have all the divine properties.
Mhm.
I don't, depends what you mean by shown. I think I can show that it's more probable that the designer of the universe has the traditional divine properties than that the universe was designed by a lesser designer. That I do think can be shown. I can't prove beyond rational doubt that that is the case, but then there's very few things in life we can prove beyond rational doubt. Um, Maybe I'm just dreaming at the moment and I'm not talking to you at all, and so on and so forth. And it was Bishop Butler, famous 18th century English bishop, who made the remark that I've always cherished: for us, and he meant for humans on earth, for us, probability is the very guide of life. And I have always thought that. So, if you look at the criteria which scientists use for judging theories to be correct, you will find, yes, if the theory is correct, it's got to yield true observations. Sure. And it has got to not yield false observations. Yes. But that won't do. Many scientists think it will do, but it's hopeless because although those criteria have to be satisfied, an infinite number of scientific theories will always satisfy those two criteria perfectly for any finite set of data. We don't have pencil and paper here, but it's really not necessary to make the point. If you think of the scientist as constructing a theory connecting two variables, x and y. And he makes certain observations that when x has this value, y has that value. And he or she finds that when x is 1, y is 1. And when x is 2, y is 2. And when x is 3, y is 3. When x is 4, y is 4. And so on for a few other numbers. And the theory he is trying to construct will have the form of a curve which describes for any value of x what is the corresponding value of y. Now, for any finite number of marks on your graph, there are an infinite number of curves that will pass through them. A straight line might be the obvious one for the ones I've mentioned, but all sorts of wiggly curves will pass through them. And it's only if the simplest one is the most probably true one that you could do science at all, or that you could make any predictions about anything in life. So the crucial further criterion is simplicity. And the simplest theory is that most probably true. Not certainly, but a lot more probably than any complicated theory. And what is simplicity? Well, I've analyzed the criteria of simplicity. Theory is simple insofar as it postulates few entities, few things, one rather than two, two rather than three, and so on. And therefore, to take the theistic example, postulates one God rather than half a dozen responsible for the universe. Or any mundane example will illustrate that. Postulates that one criminal did the crime rather than 5 in collusion, unless there's further evidence. A theory is simple insofar as it postulates few entities, few kinds of entities. Don't postulate new kinds of fundamental particle unless you have to deal with data. Few properties, few kinds of properties, and mathematically simple relations, mathematically simple values of the properties and relations between them. And so it's simpler to have a theory that says x equals y rather than a theory that says x equals y plus a large number of further terms. And for example, and if you take a real life scientific theory, say Newton's theory of gravitation, that the force between any two objects is proportional to the square of their, proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart, you could, instead of inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart, in other words, to inversely proportional r squared, you could have inversely proportional to r to the 2.00001, and that would give you exactly within the limits of accuracy which could be measured the same result. Or you could postulate that it had a certain value up to the year 2050, and after that it had a different value, and that would be compatible with the things so far. So go for the simplest. Now, I argue that one God is simpler than many gods. The God who has a property from which all the other properties follow is a simpler, far simpler one than a lot of one characterized by a lot of properties. I believe all the divine properties follow from God being eternal and being omnipotent, essentially. We could go through the moves there, but it follows from that, I believe, that he is omniscient and perfectly good, and so on.
Okay.
So these are the moves. And of course, Hume just didn't realize that that's how science works. And that's, yeah.
Okay. So that's fair enough. So I guess that's so so could we go a bit into how you would respond to the charge that the designer could be perhaps imperfect or not morally perfect, because there's some poor design, there's a lot of evil in the world. So how would you address that concern?
Well, of course, it has to be compatible with the data. And many people would urge that the suffering in the world is such that a perfectly good God would not have brought it about. And to answer that, you have to develop a theodicy, and I have done that. A theodicy means justification of God, why he would have allowed evil to occur. Well, I think the central core of any theodicy has got to be the free will defense. God gives to humans free will, and he allows them to do bad as well as good. And it's very good for us that we do have this control. If he just made us always do the good, then we would be puppets. But a generous God will create some creatures who themselves can make a difference to the world one way or the other. Good parents allow their children within limits to do morally bad actions, ones they disapprove of. And it's good for children to have this power to reject what their betters tell them. And God does that. But if they have the power to do good or ill, they are sometimes likely to do ill. And a lot of the evil in the world arises from them either deliberately doing ill or through negligence allowing it to occur. But of course, not all evil arises in that way. Some of it is what's called natural evil, evil created by pandemics or all sorts of diseases and accidents and so on. What's the point of that? Well, it gives humans not free will, but a certain kind of free will. That is to say, if there are these things, if our only choices were deliberately to do evil or not, then many of us wouldn't have very many significant choices, because our life might be so comfortable that it didn't very much matter what we do. But if there's a lot of illness and old age about, then people are faced with certain sorts of problems that they wouldn't otherwise have. If, for example, I get ill from some disease, then I have a choice as to how to face up to this, and my family has a choice of how to face up to this. They have a choice of whether to be kind and look after me or not, and I have a choice of how to deal with this patiently or not. And so it's like the grit round which the pearl may form. It gives a lot of people opportunities as to how to react in the right way or the wrong way. And so it multiplies greatly the number of serious choices open to us. And humans are so made that each time we do a good act, it's a bit easier to do a good act of that time next time, and conversely. And so we have, as a result of our free will and many of the difficulties thrown up in the world, the opportunity not merely to do good, but to form our character. And presence of evil in the world allows us to do this. It has to be a limited amount of evil, of course, and it is limited because we only live 100 years or a bit less. But nevertheless, it's necessary if we are to have a control over our own nature and destiny.
Right, okay, so that's fair enough. I think you explained that very well and succinctly. So now I guess my last objection from David Hume to the design argument at least would be what can we really know what nature is capable of producing, without an intelligent designer? So if we had an infinite universe and infinite time, couldn't matter somehow, arrange itself into a complex configuration on its own?
Well, probably yes, but we don't know, as you say. But consider an analogous problem. Suppose people play an infinite number of games of cards, and sure, in the course of these, there will be games in which one player has all the aces and the other player has all the twos, and so on. But if your only game of cards you are familiar with is one in which all the players, in which one player gets all the aces and the other gets all the twos, you must consider alternative theories as to why that is so. Not merely the theory, it's bound to happen in an infinite number of choices, so it is, but it's even more likely to happen if somebody is trying to win the game. If you were to know that there were an infinite number of games played, and if you were to know what had happened in those infinite number of games, then it might be reasonable to say, well, it sometimes happened. But if you don't know that there have been an infinite number of games and you don't know what has happened in them, it's much more reasonable to suppose that humans being what they are, there's a cheat at work. And likewise with design. You say we don't know. Everything we know about any universe at all is that it's very orderly. Things behave in just the same way here as beyond the furthest galaxy. Of course, Hume didn't know how orderly it was, but had he known that, then that's part of his data. And as far as any knowledge available is concerned, there's not the slightest reason to suppose there are universes where they don't behave in an orderly way. So it's a priori, they're much more likely to be chaotic universes than orderly universes, let alone ones without particular sort of order. So in the absence of knowledge about the universe other than the one we've got, it's most irrational to suppose that it isn't a design.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, and I appreciated the clever analogy about the playing cards. So now let's move on to Kant. So he is famous for criticizing the ontological argument, among other arguments. So, and we all, yeah, he made the familiar criticism that existence is not a real predicate. Now, you've championed many arguments for theism, but the ontological argument has not been one of them. So, do you agree with Kant, or and if you don't, would you have other criticism of
Yeah,
the
no,
argument?
I agree with Kant. I agree with Kant entirely. He's absolutely right. It's an essential premise of any ontological argument that a being which exists is more perfect than a being that doesn't. But Kant's point was you can't compare these because a being which doesn't exist doesn't have any properties at all, of perfection or otherwise. Um, uh, that it exists, and above all, that it necessarily exists, is not a property of the object, but it is characteristic that the object with defined as having certain other properties also has. What makes the object it is it being omnipotent, omniscient, and so on. And then I should have said it can't have the property of existence as a further property because it would not otherwise exist. And therefore, it can't have the property of necessary existence as a further property for the same reason.
Right. Okay. So it's good that we can find at least some common ground with Kant. So, but what about his criticisms of his more general criticisms of metaphysical theistic arguments on the basis that we cannot reason from the world of empirical experience to the conditions of experience?
Yes, that was an interesting argument, but I don't think he justified it. Um, Kant is one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest of philosophers in the respect that he brings to light questions that people had never asked before. And what they'd never asked before were what are the necessary conditions of having any sort of experience at all.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, of course, what he did say is it was necessary we could to think of any experience as having certain causes and certain effects. We couldn't, as it were, know what we are talking about unless we could locate it on the map of existence. Um, and I don't think that's quite right. Um, uh, we, in order to think of something as existing, we have to think of it perhaps as having a cause or having an effect, but we don't have to think of it as having both. And yes, there are necessary conditions for experiencing something. If we can't experience something that doesn't have a cause or doesn't have an effect because it couldn't make a difference to us. But we could experience something that didn't have an effect, except on us, and we could experience something that didn't have a cause. And more generally, we Kant did allow we could have concepts which couldn't be cached in experience, as it were. He didn't oppose the notion that we could have a concept of God as a necessary being, but he did oppose the notion that we could have any reason to suppose there was such a being. So he's not as extreme as Hume in any way,
Right.
but his particular arguments showing, purporting to show that once you postulate a being who has the divine properties, you get involved in various antinomies. I just don't think they work. He says we have to suppose something, anything that has a cause itself has a cause, and go back in time forever. But alternatively, we have to suppose that things are started off in some way, and so we are forced to think of both of these things, but we're not forced to think of both of these things. One of them's wrong and the other's right, and it's more probable that one's right, and so on. So I have various detailed criticisms of this, and but on his attack on ontological arguments, I agree with him. But I should say that I don't regard that as a deficiency for theism, that ontological arguments don't work. Because supposing they did work, then what would have been shown is that the existence of God exists because the most perfect, and something is more perfect if it exists than if it didn't. That's beginning to look like there being an explanation in terms of some super metaphysical principle that there's a God. But if God is God, there isn't going to be an explanation in terms of something bigger than God. And whereas all the other arguments are not arguments from purported causes of God, they're arguments from purported effects of God. And that's the difference. That's why I believe in the latter and not the former.
Well, that's a very interesting response. And do you have time for one more question, or do you want to wrap it up now?
Yes, go on.
Okay. So finally, I would like to ask you about Hume's notorious critique of the credibility of miracle reports. So could you please just explain what that was, and then maybe assess it briefly, of course.
Hume said, putting it not quite in his terms, but in mine, it would always be more rational to suppose that someone had misobserved a purported miracle than that they had observed it correctly. Because if you just take what might be a typical miracle, somebody rising in the air while praying, levitating, it would only be a miracle if it was a violation of natural laws. But, says Hume, every bit of evidence for humans don't levitate is evidence against this having happened. On the other side, all you've got is a few observers, and there will always be, as it were, less weight than all the general observations of what normally happens. That was his argument, but I find it deficient. It might be right, as it were, if you assume that there is the laws of nature are the ultimate determinants of what happens. But of course, on a theistic view, they're not the ultimate determinants of what happens. God conserves the laws of nature, and God at times sets them apart. So you need to have a reason to suppose in advance, not an overwhelming reason, but some reason, that there is a God. And then it becomes, given that there is some probability that there is a God, then it becomes to some extent probable he has reason for interfering in nature in some cases, simply to show us what he's like, or answer our prayers. And in that case, as it were, there's a lot more evidence in favor of miracles than Hume allowed. You have to take into account your general worldview and whether it's supported. And therefore, for that reason, I think the evidence for can outweigh the evidence against.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I think that was a very nice, brief, succinct response. And you've written a book on this topic, haven't you?
Oh, well, yes. Well, let's see. Yes, one of my, I think it was my second short book, was called The Concept of Miracle, but I have included chapters on that in much more recent works, and there's a chapter on that in my big book, The Existence of God, which is much more up to date.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. And you've also and correct me if I'm wrong, but don't you also address this in your two books, The Resurrection of God Incarnate and Was Jesus God?
Yes, I do. But I'm concerned there with just the evidence for one particular
Okay.
miracle, the resurrection. But a more general discussion of what would be evidence for miracles is to be found on the whole in other writing.
I see. Okay, thanks. Speaking of books, so do you have any current scholarly projects, and do you anticipate writing another book, or was Are We Bodies or Souls your last one?
Well, that depends on how long I've got.
That's true.
Not merely to live, but I mean to do serious philosophy. And if I had a number of years to do, I would certainly be writing another book. I've been involved in a couple of minor projects at the moment, but a short book of, oh, well, I won't go into the details, but a book which I'm making a contribution to, another book I'm making a rather larger contribution to. But I would like to do something a bit fuller again. I've written about free will from time to time, but I don't think I got it quite right or really interesting enough. And I would like to do something a lot fuller on free will. I'd also like to do something a lot fuller on the nature of morality, and in particular about the difference God makes to morality, and so to the nature why Christian morality might be expected to be a bit different from other sorts of morality.
I see. Well, those are all very interesting projects. We'll keep an eye out for them. Hopefully,
It won't be for a year or two or three.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that concludes our interview. So thanks for joining us, Richard Swinburne.
Okay. You are. All the best.